an evaluation of progress up to now in the integrated maritime policy. So we'll give the floor first to the rapporteur for 4 minutes. Madam Meissner.
Thank you, President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry this chamber is not full, not just because it's my first report, but because this is a very important issue. It's not very well known, but it's very important. Integrated maritime policy is not familiar with, we're not familiar in this House very much, but it's extremely important. Let's not forget that 70% of the Earth's surface consists of water. We have a growing population, not in Europe, but around the world, 9 billion in 2050. The world is now becoming too clean, and many experts have found that there's a great deal of potential in the seas. And therefore, what we now have to do is to preserve the resources of the sea for ensuing generations by having a proper IMP. Only 10% of the seas have so far been researched, but nevertheless, we obtain 50,000 products from the sea. We've already started to get raw materials, energy, and raw materials for medicine, cosmetics, and industry from the sea. And it's important in our maritime policy to make sure that we don't over-exploit the sea in horrific ways, as you can read in modern science fiction novels. So we have to take care of the seas. It's going to be a very important factor in the future economy. People are now talking not just about green jobs, but also blue jobs, that's to say maritime jobs. The EU has 320,000 kilometres of sea coast. 40% of our population lives near the coast. And this is why we're very keen on having safe green ships and a great safe green integrated maritime policy. So what are we concerned about mainly here? Well, first of all, in IMP, of course, we're concerned with transport. Shipping is the muscle of transport in Europe, because such 95% of our exports outside Europe are carried by the sea. 40% of our trade within Europe is carried by sea, and this is going to grow according to forecasts. So we have to make sure that we reduce emissions from shipping in the future, because there's going to be an increase in shipping volume. When it comes to shipbuilding, we have a great deal of know-how which we can use, and we have to use that in order to be productive, make safe ships, green ships, and at the same time produce jobs. Also with IMP, we're concerned with fisheries and aquaculture. Fish, obviously, are a source of food. Aquaculture is an area which is growing very fast in terms of food production, the fastest growing food production sector. We have oil and gas pipelines going through the sea, we have oil platforms, we have offshore wind parks, and people are already thinking in terms of kite-driven tankers in order to save energy by using wind energy. Wave energy is a potential for the future, and also we can use the sea as a source for biomass. So research is looking more and more into blue technology, especially in the area of medicines. For example, we now have painkillers, we have anti-malaria drugs, and anti-cancer drugs derived from the sea. We also have to protect our coasts from storms and floods. We have to also protect our coasts from oil spills, piracy, and smugglers. And these are the problems, the whole range of problems we have to deal with IMP. We shouldn't forget also the coasts are important for tourism. We're now beginning to develop a tourism policy for our coastal regions. So there are all these areas, you see, which are connected with the sea. And the aim of IMP is to try and deal with all these things in a harmonious fashion altogether. Not many people are aware of the importance of this effort. I know the EU has done a lot already in this area, but it still has to do a lot more. And therefore, in this report, and I haven't dealt with individual areas of activity in great detail, what I've tried to do is give us an overview of what's happened in recent years, what we want to see happening in the future. I've put forward the idea of the importance of the blue paper in the future for a successful and integrated European IMP.
Thank you very much. Next, Madam Geoghegan-Quinn on behalf of the Commission.
Colleagues and President, firstly I would like to say that my colleague, the Commissioner Damanaki, is in Portugal at the moment on behalf of the President Barroso at a very important conference about the maritime policy.
that maritime policy matters, and I would like to congratulate the rapporteur, Mrs Meissner, for this very fine report. The European Commission very much welcomes this excellent report and its favourable view of our integrated maritime policy. This report is more than a mere stock-taking exercise. It also sets out an ambitious, inclusive and detailed vision for the future of maritime policy. Not for the first time in discussing integrated maritime policies, the Parliament has led by example. The report is the product of admirable cross-committee cooperation, which adds democratic legitimacy to our policy. Moreover, it opens up new horizons, not least with the welcome participation of national and regional parliaments and authorities, to help shape our integrated maritime policy to become a truly operational policy of relevance that will create more jobs and better quality jobs. The European Commission is confident that the policy demands in this report will impact positively on future maritime policy for three important reasons. Firstly, in taking a forward-looking approach to the maritime dimension of the Europe 2020 strategy and ensuring sustainable growth in maritime sectors and coastal regions. Secondly, they will point the way towards emerging policy objectives where the European Commission and the European Parliament should work together. These include Europe's approach to climate change mitigation in coastal regions and to sustainable coastal tourism, support for greener, safer and more competitive shipping through the common maritime space without borders, and further action on maritime safety and accident prevention. Thirdly, this report provides a coherent and constructive set of proposals for future actions, and I very much look forward to hearing the views expressed during this debate. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Madam Commissioner. We'll now hear the opinion from the Fisheries Committee, and that's Mr. Kuhn. Thank you very much. Madam Commissioner, first of all, could I express my thanks to Ms Meissner, who has done an integrated job here in the true sense of the term. She didn't just look at maritime policy, she involved all the specialties that relate to it, and I'd also like to say that it is necessary for fisheries and fish farming to be a major part of integrated maritime policy. We need to point out that fisheries products, fish products and aquaculture products in the European Union amount to about 2 million tonnes in the European Union every year. And we export 8 million tonnes. We're a major world player in this market. It's one of our important resources, and as been said, one of the key factors in this is spatial planning at sea. You know, what are the priorities? Fishing grounds and protected areas for pisciculture should have a high priority. And obviously that's important in the light of safety at sea as well. Shipping lines need to be closely observed. We talk about regenerative energy, offshore wind farms which are out there producing energy in our seas more and more. That too needs to be looked at in the light of fish farming and safety at sea considerations. Again, we certainly need to say that research and development in the fisheries technologies as well are very important. We've had 15 million euros from the Commission for that. That's not enough, Madam Commissioner. Please take that message back with you. Now, of course, this policy cannot end at Europe's borders. We've got to agree with our neighbours on this. Look at Iceland, for example. Look at some of the things that have happened up there, and Libya, Egypt too. There are major challenges there. Thank you very much for having patience with me, President. Thank you, Mr. Kuhn. Next, the opinion from the Regional Development Committee, and that's by Mr. Stavrakakis for 1 minute.
Commissioner, The viable use of the marine environment is absolutely essential for the viability of development in Europe across the board, and also in countries where the economy is directly linked to the sea. Balanced development of certain basic areas such as fisheries, agriculture, tourism and industry could guarantee the professional future and income for citizens. From the point of view of regional development, what's absolutely critical here is the raising the bar for integrated regional development for the internal market. That means we've got to further promote the advantages for short sea shipping and maritime cabotage. We've got to improve links between far-flung maritime regions and the islands that lie between these regions and the continent, and look at economic concentrations here, because that's very important for social, economic and territorial cohesion. Another important thing is the innovative policy we see in the IMP, which seeks to fight against the fragmentation of maritime policies, and that's very important for the efficiency of European actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speakers on behalf of the political groups. First, Mr. KOUMOUTSAKOS, 2 minutes.
Η ολοκληρωμένη θαλάσσια πολιτική είναι πολύ σημαντική για την Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, our IMP is fundamental for the European Union. It's important that we use the seas as well as we possibly can. Obviously, the seas are also very important in European culture and history. But the main thing is to manage the seas efficiently for the benefit of the whole of Europe, and especially people living in maritime areas. We have to have more research, more innovation. We have to have better developed shipyards, and ports and harbours, and better organised shipping on the high seas. And also we need better organised trade over the seas. Europe is a prime European shipping power, and it's very important that we protect the interests of our fleet, because it's so important to us in terms of trade and GDP. So any decisions we take in this area are extremely important and have to be properly implemented. And there we have to be really effective in the IMO. We should not ignore the importance of the IMO, and I think this could have been emphasised a little more in the report. We have to work together with our partners. We have to make sure that United Nations conventions on the seas are complied with. That's why paragraph 25 in the report is very important. Paragraph 25 calls on all countries, all coastal countries, coastal states, to resolve delimitation issues on the basis of UNCLOS and agree on the maritime zones. What is also very important is the coastal regions in Europe, which are of particular importance to our economy in the European Union. So I'd like to thank our colleague, our rapporteur, for her report and for the way she cooperated with everybody else in drawing it up. Now, Chairman, I believe deeply in the competitiveness of the European fleet, and that it should be upheld, and that's why I do have a number of questions concerning Mrs. Meissner's own amendments, which she tabled a few days ago.
Thank you, Mr. Fleckenstein. 2 minutes as well. Madam President and my dear colleagues, first of all, congratulations to Ms. Meissner for this report, and thanks for the good cooperation. We agree with you that we shouldn't really be looking at the sectoral aspect of maritime policy in the various member states. We should be looking more at the coordination of maritime policy in and between member states. If we look to the future, the area of our seas are shrinking. We have the free areas at sea are shrinking because we have so many shipping lines, we have fish farming, we have wind farms and so on. There will be more stress on the environment, there will be conflicts of interests, and that's why we need this good coordination. I can't cover all aspects of this, but briefly let me speak about the problem of sulphur emissions and their control. I'm not trying to change the limit values. In the North Sea and the Baltic, it will be influenced by the switch from road to sea in transport, but we'll find out. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. We'll discuss it with the Commission when we know the results. But within the European Union, there are differences between North and South. We have to strike a balance between the two, get rid of the disparities, and that must be the Commission's job as well. There is one thing I'm very happy about here. We've been talking for a long time about the strategic importance of the shipbuilding industry for Europe. We say that innovation is particularly important in this area. That's the only way that industry will survive. So we need a coordinated industrial strategy and policy for shipbuilding. The member states need the right financial systems to deal with this. I see that as very important, although the Conservatives and Liberals here don't seem to support that view. But my dear colleagues, how are you going to support the shipbuilding in Europe? Are you just going to give them a clap on the back and words of encouragement? No, we and the Social Democrats want something more and better proposals. Thank you.
Kollege Fleckenstein als
Thank you very much. Next speaker, also for 2 minutes, Ms. Bilbao Barandica.
Thank you very much, President. A third of our citizens live on coastlines, and the European Union is the largest world maritime power. An integrated maritime policy linked to the 2020 strategy is going to enable us to strengthen our leadership, but it's necessary to have a global intersectoral policy which takes into account all of the agents of civil society and strategies and competences of local, regional authorities in coastal zones. We've got to think about the sea and the coastal areas as an opportunity, and therefore we have to strengthen sustainable fisheries policy and deal with the difficulties people face when they live at sea. And we've also got to be very responsible in our approach. We've got to improve security so that fishing vessels working in European waters and elsewhere can receive support when it comes to piracy and other problems. We need a strategic approach for naval or shipbuilding, for example, which is struggling with competition from the Southeast Asia, and we've got to be more supportive there. We also have to have a policy for the reduction of CO2 emissions and better use of renewable energies. We've got to apply innovation and interinstitutional coordination and financial instruments and a clear definition, a clear idea of the fact that Europe really backs this sector, and we've got to apply this to all sectors. We've got to have a sustainable approach and a level of research and development which means we can create high-level jobs and protect things that we really love, because we've got to continue living with the sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bilbao. And the next speaker for 2.5 minutes, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, President, Commissioner and colleagues. On behalf of the Green EFA Group, I'd like to thank the rapporteur, Mrs. Meissner, for drawing together this report and developing it alongside the other political groups. As 71% of the Earth's surface is covered with water, it does really make sense to try and develop an integrated maritime policy. And of course, Europe has 305,000 kilometres of coastline. So that was the Commission's intent back in 2009 when it announced a more horizontal policy approach on areas such as maritime transport, the marine environment and regional and fisheries policies. And today we see the response of the Transport Committee to this fresh direction in the shape of Mrs. Meissner's report. Well, we will be supporting this report. It's a useful step in the right direction toward caring and sustainably using our maritime resource. But we believe there is still much work to be done. We welcome the report's suggestions on maritime governance, on sea basin initiatives and strategies, on maritime spatial planning and surveillance, a maritime research framework and observation and data network, and a fund for maritime infrastructure. I am particularly pleased to report that the report now includes the integration of carbon emission reduction targets and support for renewable solar and wind energies on board vessels. When it comes to the vote later on today, I'd particularly like to ask members to support the rapporteur's recommendation amendment, which seeks to include the option of including emission trading schemes into the EU and IMO rules. This was an issue over which the TRAN committee was evenly split at 20 votes each. So it is perfectly right that Mrs Meissner has brought it here today for plenary to vote on it. So I would ask members to show some 2020 vision and vote for the rapporteur's amendment, which does recognise that these measures sit squarely alongside our wider strategic objectives around CO2 reduction and the Europe 2020 project. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. And now, Mr. Stevenson, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, President and Commissioner. I welcome the development of an integrated maritime policy that enshrines and enhances the principles of subsidiarity, competitiveness and the sustainable use of marine resources. I do not, however, support the resurrection of the concept of a European Coast Guard. This was rejected once before. I don't believe it's necessary. I believe it's far too expensive at a time of financial stringency. A directive on maritime spatial planning, I also believe, would be an unnecessary luxury, which would not, in my view, add value to the current process of cooperation between member states. Can I also mention in this context the impact of offshore wind, wave and tidal energy projects, together with the designation of marine protected areas on inshore and artisanal fisheries? We cannot simply draw lines on maps designating vast areas of inshore waters as MPAs or for renewable energy. Small-scale fishermen cannot be arbitrarily displaced without full consultation. The designation of such areas must be a bottom-up and not a top-down process, and it must involve stakeholder consultation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. Next for 2 minutes, Mr. Kohlíček. 2 minutes.
Herr Vorsitzende, milé kolegyně, vážení
colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, integrated maritime policy isn't discussed for the first time, but it is still very difficult to marry all the aspects of environment, fisheries, energy policy and so on, and to put it in one single framework. The Commission reports basically responds to the implementation of the Blue Paper Plan of 2007, and 56 out of 65 measures has been initiated or terminated. We deal with a better connection of the policies and better use of inland resources and inland waterways. Of course, the attention is paid especially to Rhine, Maas and the connection between Danube and Main. Unfortunately, the middle part of the Danube, downstream from Vienna, and Elbe from Magdeburg against the stream, has been left on the sidelines. And we talk about it much less. It's been really left at the margins of the Commission's and Council's interest. And that's a pity, because it leaves a huge untapped potential, and it increases the pressure to extend transshipment ports, which transferred cargo from vessels to rails and to roads. And of course that the integration of naval, rail and road transport must also deal with questions of environmental protection and energy policies. And so we can add a few other questions to the questions that Madam Meissner poses, and that is the linking of maritime and inland waterway transport and the wider context. We must clearly implement the whole maritime package. And point 21, where we must prevent environment, I think that what is important is to clean up oil tankers and the decommissioning of obsolete vessels, because current state of play is really dismal. Otherwise GUNGL is a grease.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kohlíček. And now for 1.5 minutes, Ms. Rosbach.
for en velfunderet og
Thank you, President. I welcome this very important report on which I have almost nothing to add. I would just like to refer to the fact that we really do need proper coordination in order to respond to all the different challenges we face. There's of course the problem of maritime pollution. I'm particularly concerned about this, and here we've adopted a great number of reports in this connection which have been forgotten, even though adopted. Let us not forget either that we had a protocol agreement adopted about 9 months ago in this Parliament on cooperation between the Member States to cooperate on disasters on the high seas from the North Sea to the Baltic. Since that protocol was adopted, I haven't received any further information from the European Commission. Has there been any development there? Has there a scheme been set up for cooperation from Member States in combating disasters from the North Sea to the Baltic? I'd like to know about that. In the meantime, of course, we've had the Gulf of Mexico oil spill and indeed other disasters, and one can be very worried about the same thing potentially happening in the North Sea. So my question to the Commission is, do we have a proper anti-disaster scheme to counter such an event on the high seas in the European Union? Thank you. Thank you. Next, on behalf of the, on his own right, Mr. Obermayr.
Thank you very much. It's the last minute, and if we continue at this speed, then I'm afraid we're going to have too much of our oxygen polluted. It's not just a question of climate protection as we do it in the EU, because seawater knows no borders, so I just don't see the sense in failing to take measures when the wealthy industrial nations simply export their environmental problems to the third world. We have these ships sailing from Europe with tons of asbestos and other toxic waste to India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. Entire coastal regions are destroyed, and then they have to come back again. I'm not even going to mention the workers in these countries who have to risk their lives because of inadequate safety arrangements, and it's a very dangerous job, a shipbreaker. Anyway, I really think we should call on Commissioner Oettinger to make an effort to organise safety measures for these people and for the oil platforms. Every day we see huge tankers sailing our seas. One positive thing is that even the shipping companies now have realised the problem and are starting to do their own safety work and to prevent collisions, for example. It would be a very good thing if the EU could support this positive private action. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was now the individual speakers. First, Mr. ITÄLÄ for 2 minutes. Thank you very much, President, and I'd also like to thank the rapporteur for an excellent job, and particularly for the fact that she has tackled the problem of sulphur emissions, which is very important. I think that the Commission should really pay attention to this decision once Parliament supports it. Too much has been done without proper impact assessments and environmental cost assessment, and this would be a mistake. This, of course, distorts competition within the EU because we have different arrangements or different limits on emissions in the north and in the south, and this, I think, is, if we continue to do that, then we will be violating EU competition rules. As a result, we will be losing millions. Our industry will be losing millions every year, and many jobs will be at threat in Finland and in other parts of the Union. So we need the kind of decision that will bring us jobs, not destroy them. We have Russian ships that are taking over all the trade from Finnish ships because they're not subject to the same rules. The Swedes have expressed their concern about this as well, both from an environmental standpoint and from an employment standpoint. This is a bad decision, and we really need to revoke it and listen to Parliament. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege ITÄLÄ. Es folgt nun.
Thank you, Mr. ITÄLÄ. Now 1.5 minutes for Mr. Milana.
Thank you, and thank you to the rapporteur. On integrated maritime policy, we've got to get past good intentions and put a new impetus behind a strategy which will be an opportunity for growth and development in the European Union and make up the huge waste of time or loss of time in the fight against disasters at sea, natural disasters, and their effect on the climate. Just in the last few days we've seen a terrible event of this kind in the city of Paola in Calabria. So we've got to use not just the instruments of governance but targeted legislation to wipe out the consequences of the errors of the past due to an approach that was too narrow, too sectoral. It's a very complex issue here, very difficult to deal with, take a lot of hard work. We need the right investment, and we need participatory governance measures, both institutionally and in international cooperation. The Mediterranean is a particular problem because of the complexity of legal arrangements, and therefore it will be of fundamental importance to see the management of the Mediterranean basin as the work of the heritage, indeed, of all its littoral states, and we must put an end to the bilateral declarations of protected areas around the Mediterranean, which I think is which really requires effective and shared governance. Libya's interpretation of some of the rules has caused tremendous harm to Europe's fishing fleet, and well, we wouldn't want the whole thing to be dealt with as an Italo-Libyan problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Milana. Now Ms. Lepage for 1 minute. Thank you, President. First of all, my thanks to Mrs. Meissner, our rapporteur, for her excellent report and for her cooperation with the other groups, in particular my group, and she undertook great efforts to foster and adopt our amendments. Maritime policy is very important in these modern times. I think priority should be attached here to upholding and preserving the maritime environment. We already have a framework directive on this, and other instruments will have to be strengthened here, especially as regards the integrated management of coastal zones and the management of our maritime zones. We now need a new real EU community for the seas, so that we don't have this artificial boundary between measures we take on land and measures we take at sea. I hope that the Commissioner Damanaki will note this point. As regards the Blue Paper, we're looking forward to this, and we hope that the work to be done by DG Mare will lead to more knowledge, more research and more jobs in maritime affairs. Having said that, once again, I'd like to thank Mrs. Meissner for having taken our points into account in her report. Thank you, Ms. Lepage. And now for 2 minutes, Ms. Lövin.
Herr talman.
President, honourable members, the integrated maritime policy is a very welcome strategy, given that our seas are linked to each other and all sectors that use the sea have a common impact on the maritime environment, which means it would be very irresponsible to continue taking decisions on the seas without taking into account the accumulative effect that fisheries, dredging, vessels, tourism and so on have on the sea. The idea of this IMP is that it has to be linked to other policies, and that means that all member states have to have a good environmental situation in their seas by 2020. And if this is going to be possible, then all member states, as soon as possible, have to start integrating practices when it comes to the IMP, so that decisions can be taken in one place. I can give you an example of how wrong it can go when different parts of the seas are governed by different sets of rules and different authorities. In the southern Kattegat in Sweden, Sweden and Denmark have agreed that they are going to protect spawning grounds for cod, and this is a desperate attempt to protect depleting cod stocks. But another authority in Sweden recently decided that the municipality in Falkenberg is going to dump massive amounts of mud from ports in the sea, precisely in this spawning ground for cod. So the authorities now have to be able to create sustainable environments in the sea by 2020. That's their responsibility, and that means they have to go along with marine spatial planning and operate responsibly in order to achieve these objectives. With spatial planning, we're also going to have to make it much clearer what different interests exist in the sea, what powers want to exploit the sea, and make sure that everybody's working along the same rules. Companies have to have impact assessments and follow best practices and work along the principle of precaution. All of these things are very important. I think this is an excellent big step in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lövin. And now for 1.5 minutes, Mr. Grobarczyk.
Thank you, Chairman. Madam Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, the report on integrated maritime policy is an opportunity to reflect a little more profoundly. A short presentation of the report in accordance with Article 48 and a limited possibility of presenting amendments against the principle of rejecting the amendments by the European Commission does not offer any optimism, and it does not mean that the European Commission takes a serious attitude to integrated maritime policy. There is a crisis in this particular field, dumping from the Far East and an escape of ship owners to countries where cheaper services are offered, as well as bad news from shipping industry add to all of this. In my country, 2 largest shipyards were unfortunately liquidated under the pressure by the European Commission, and unfortunately the Polish government added to that problem. This created a situation in which unemployment rose, and a lot of former employees of the shipyards had to go away from Poland. And I believe that we have to take a serious attitude and very responsible to integrated maritime policy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grobarczyk. Next speaker for 1.5 minutes, Mr. Ferreira.
Thank you, President. There's a great deal of activity, political activity, industrial activity, transport activity, energy, tourism, along our coastlines and on the high seas, and that means that we need an integrated policy supporting all these activities in the marine environment in respect of the various ecosystems. And there you have to take into account local specificities, local features, local needs, if we're going to have an integrated maritime policy, which also should be integrated with an integrated fisheries policy. There we need a clear set of plans and a clear implementation. We have to appreciate that an enormous proportion of our population depends on the sea and on a healthy maritime and ocean environment. We have to understand also that our seas are linked with other seas around the world in our integrated maritime policy. At the same time, the member states have to have their economic interest zones on the high seas and territorial waters respected as part of this overall scheme, so that they can continue to benefit from the natural comparative advantage in terms of maritime industries. We need new technologies new engineering projects, new forms of building vessels, more sustainable environmental policy for the seas. We need to modernise our maritime industries, make sure that we have sustainable fisheries without overloading European financial resources. All these things have to be done in an IMP, not forgetting the ultra-peripheral regions of the EU either.
Ferreira.
Thank you very much. Next speaker for 2 minutes will be Mr. Griffin.
Before taking advice from any expert, it's wise to examine their record to check that they are competent. The Integrated Maritime Policy Report is partly the work of the Fisheries Committee, so before buying into its grand schemes, it's worthwhile taking a critical look at the European Union's record on the management of the seas. Inevitably, this means assessing the situation in the former sovereign UK waters, secretly betrayed to European bureaucracy control in 1973. Since nearly 70% of so-called EU fishing stocks are actually British fishing stocks. How have our fish and our fishermen fared under the common fisheries policy? The figures tell us far more than all the fine words in this report. 88% of the EU stocks are overfished, against a global average of about 27%. 30% of our fish species are now officially outside safe biological limits because there are too few adult fish left for normal reproduction. Under the CFP's obscene quota system, nearly 1 million tonnes of fish are discarded dead into the North Sea alone every year. Meanwhile, the industrial hoovering up of species such as sand eels has led to crashing populations of bird species such as puffins. To Europe's south, the picture is just as bad. West African fishermen, whose lifestyle has been sustained for generations, are forced to switch to people trafficking because EU-registered vessels have helped fish their waters to extinction. It's time for the EU to acknowledge that its record in maritime management is the worst in the entire world. A typical example of what is known as the tragedy of the commons, the phenomenon by which shared resources always get exploited ruthlessly because anyone who exercises restraint is disadvantaged by the unscrupulous. It is time to restore control of the seas and fishing grounds to the sovereign nations whose track record has shown them fit to exercise such stewardship. In the case of 2/3 of EU waters that the EU's fished to extinction, that means the British nation and British fishermen. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Griffin. Als nächstes
Thank you very much, Mr. Griffin. Next for 2 minutes, Mr. de Grandes Pascual.
Señor presidente, señora comisaria, señorías.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. I think we must congratulate the rapporteur, Ms. Meissner. There have been various views that have been presented, and she's managed to come up with compromise solutions which have made it possible for us to join together behind this report. The Transport Committee has decided that all seas should be protected in a similar way, and therefore we think that if it's not the case, we will see unfair competition. We accept the position of the majority in favour of a legal situation with uniform rules for all of the EU. However, it is important to be aware that there is a lack of equality. The Baltic Sea and the North Sea and the English Channel are more polluted areas, and controls on sulphur limits therefore ought to be more stringent in those cases, I think. One must positively view measures on ports regarding attempts to reduce transport times and costs for transport, but I think it's important to bear in mind that we have other issues to deal with. I have to mention liberalisation of ports. We mustn't move beyond the broader role there. I'd also like to mention the aim to come up with a strategy to modify the specific repercussions of climate change and reducing CO2. I think this is a positive report and we must vote in favour of it, but we must not forget that this is in the context of a serious disaster, which is what happened in the Gulf of Mexico. We call on the Commission to look at whether the review of the European Maritime Safety Agency should strengthen the role of that agency when it comes to inspections and prevention and other tasks in preventing fuel pollution. I think we need to strengthen those tasks and give a stronger mandate in that area. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege de Grandes Pascual.
Thank you, Mr. de Grandes Pascual. Now for 2 minutes, Mr. El Khadraoui.
Dank u wel, voorzitter. Mevrouw de commissaris, collega's, ik zou om te beginnen collega
Madam Commissioner, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, first of all let me thank our colleague Mrs. Meissner for the remarkable job that she's done in achieving a consensus for this report. I'd also like to take this opportunity as my group's coordinator to pay tribute to our former colleague Ville ITÄLÄ, who unfortunately left us 2 years ago, who did a great deal of work in this Parliament in turning this integrated maritime policy into a reality. It is of course clear that this is a complex sector with many different sides to it. And there are different aims, different objectives to meet. We need the right structures, for example. We need the necessary dynamism for this sector, which provides a lot of jobs right across Europe, at the same time as that being essential for developing our ports. We speak about structures, and that also means European structures. So the European agency needs to have an enhanced role, for which purpose it needs powers and resources. Otherwise it won't be able to deal with things like the oil disasters or oil drilling. So the agency needs to be given a stronger role. We also need better cooperation between national monitoring and inspection agencies and the European agency, with a greater role for the European agency. It's also necessary to stress the importance of the environment. Shipping pollutes more than it should. We are talking about standards and rules for sulfur emissions, but we also need to consider the emissions trading system, and through that it should be possible to exercise pressure, or rather for that purpose it should be necessary to exercise pressure on the International Maritime Organization. And lastly, young people need to be more involved.
Next speaker for 1 minute, Mrs. Reimers. Thank you, President, colleagues. Integrated maritime policy is a topic for the future. We have greater intensive use of the seas because of offshore energy, because of fisheries, and I think that this is something we need to continue to develop. But of course this area has its limits. We have responsibilities. We need to make sure that we work together in a constructive way. Therefore we need to look at the protection of seas and the use of seas, and they are not contradictory terms. We need to, I think, do all of this together. That will be beneficial to all of us. It's important for instance, us to follow the example of the Baltic Sea strategy and the countries that border on the Baltic Sea and what they have done in terms of infrastructure, coastal tourism. All of this needs to be promoted. And we need to look at fisheries. Of course, the weak position of fisheries, that's something that we should not forget about, because it's important for us to remember that these people are supplying us with food, and therefore it is absolutely essential for our coastal economy. I would like to congratulate my colleague for an excellent report. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin Reimers. Herr Kollege Czarnecki.
Thank you, Mrs. Reimers. Mr. Czarnecki is not in the chamber, unfortunately, so I give the floor to Mr. Hoarau for 1.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much.
Děkuji mnohokrát, pane předsedo. Musíme se podívat na velké vizi, které nám
de transport, de tourisme, d'énergie, de richesse minière et biologique, de recherche combinée au changement climatique. C'est un potentiel de développement considérable qu'il convient de sécuriser, de protéger et de mettre en valeur durablement, car l'avenir de l'humanité en dépend. Le rapport note également, et à juste titre, que l'Union européenne est la première puissance maritime mondiale et que ses régions ultrapériphériques lui offrent la plus grande zone.
The outlying regions are part of an exclusive economic zone. It's therefore very important for the European Union to pursue an ambitious policy on seas. If we are not the world's foremost maritime policy and we don't do that, then who will do this in our place? However, the resolution does not go very far along these lines. It's not with 50 million euros that we are going to be able to take a leading role when it comes to global policies. Finally, the outermost regions do have a very important strategic position. They're present in all oceans, and it would be helpful if we could ensure that they play an important role in a strategy for the oceans, which unfortunately has not been taken up in this report, and I regret that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. HOARAU. And the next speaker for 2 minutes, Mrs. Patrão Neves.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Commissioner, the oceans and the seas represent 70% of the surface area of the world. They've been part of our life throughout humanity's history. They've given us food through fish. They've given communication between peoples across the sea. There are traditional maritime industries, which are transport and fisheries, but at the moment the sea is taking on a new role in the globalized world as something geostrategic, with Europe in the central of it. There's also a period of new challenges for the oceans, exploiting their energy and mineral resources, which over and above fish and transport therefore require a holistic perception and a concerted approach, which is what Mrs. Meissner has tried to suggest in her report. Planning of Europe's maritime space is something fundamental for the future, particularly for coastal areas and particularly for the outermost regions. If the IMP is going to be a whole greater than its parts, and it's going to encourage the fisheries industry, then there will have to be clusters of maritime activities so that there is synergy, bringing together different determinations and overcoming difficulties arising from the overlapping of interests in our maritime areas. The most sensitive ecological areas need to be taken into consideration, and there needs to be sustainable fishery with ever more selective gear, that being fundamental to achieve the aims established for the 2012 Johannesburg Summit. So we need transsectoral policies covering different maritime activities, meeting their needs and their respective peculiarities in terms of their use of the sea. The protection of the oceans is a moral obligation that we have to ourselves and to future generations.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Patrão Neves. The next speaker for 1.5 minutes, Mr. Danellis. Thank you very much. Thank you, President. Madam Commissioner, developing our European policies, I think we've always, of course, focused on the seas when developing these policies, and I think this is all the more true after the Lisbon Treaty. We are duty-bound to protect the environment. We also need to create jobs. We need to create synergies, dynamism, making sure that Europe is competitive. Now, our maritime policy is a policy area that needs to be seen as a holistic one. It needs to involve all sectors which are in one way or another linked to the seas. If we want to make rational use of our seas, then we have to act. And in order to do that, it is absolutely essential for us to have a good overview of the situation. All of us, I think, need to work in a multidisciplinary fashion. That's the only way of making sure that we really give an advantage to all the different regions of Europe. Some regions are particularly affected by maritime activities. We need to bear them in mind. So I think we're there as a kind of coast guard, really, for Europe. At the same time, I think we would all agree in saying that maritime activities have their own role to play from an ecological point of view. Incidentally, I think we have seen this in the context of the International Maritime Organization, the IMO. If the European Union is able to speak with one voice there, that would be a very good thing. If, however, Europe appears in a fragmented way, then that, unfortunately, would be a total disaster for our fleet. So we need a general reform, I think. And let's not forget that maritime activities, by their very nature, are international. Thank you very much, Mr. Danellis. The next speaker for 1.5 minutes, Mrs. Serracchiani.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm grateful to Mrs. Meissner for her report on the integrated maritime policy. I agree with her on the need to strengthen shipping and shipbuilding and the whole coastal area, encouraging also innovation and research. Shipping plays a fundamental role in our commercial life today. So there needs to be more cooperation between small and large ports facing onto the same sea in order to encourage more fluid, better flowing trade. We also need to encourage intermodality, which means investing in ports, infrastructure and their hinterland, particularly the ones that can be connected with European corridors. And lastly, there's another subject that we shouldn't forget, safety in ports. There needs to be a standardization of all safety measures within all European ports in order better to protect shipping and to avoid unfair competition at the expense of those ports which achieve greater security and safety and therefore have to face up to greater expense.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Serracchiani. That brings us on to the Catch the Eye part of the procedure. Mr. Marinescu is the first speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The development of an integrated maritime policy is an absolute necessity, given the fragmented approach in the past that led to inefficiency and conflicts. Mrs. Meissner's report brings forward the Parliament's position in terms of creating an integrated process, a common process in terms of seas, coastal areas and maritime sectors. The integrated maritime policy brings about a transsectoral approach of maritime governance and promotes the identification and use of synergies between various EU policies pertaining to this field. This proposal of a regulation foresees a program that will secure a stable framework for the initiatives in this field and will bring about a more coherent use of resources in sea and coastal areas. This is the only solution in the current context was a modest financial contribution from the EU. But I hope this financial contribution will, however, bring about the fulfillment of the objectives in the short and medium run. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marinescu. The next speaker, Mr. Alves.
Obrigado, Presidente.
Mr. President, smart growth of the kind recommended in the 2020 strategy will only be achieved if we intelligently mobilize the different potentials that we have in our economy. We have an enormous exclusive economic zone, the biggest one in the world in Europe. A third of our population lives along the coast, managing 40% of our gross domestic product and 25% of our external trade. So those are numbers that should make the Commission and Council act. They have to realize that they can't do without an integrated maritime policy if they want a smart growth, which is essential for the 2020 strategy to be a success. In particular, there is biogenetic and mineral wealth in the bottom of our seas which needs to be protected. This is little known. We need a greater effort of research and development in those areas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alves. And the next speaker, Mr. Theurer.
Herr Präsident, Frau
President, Commissioner, colleagues, the world's oceans must be maintained as ecosystems. Global seas and globalization belong together, though. Shipping lanes are key to our prosperity. They are the adders, the veins of world trade, and in this connection we must do a great deal to guarantee environmental protection and safeguard transport lanes, but we also need to ensure that we safeguard raw materials, and here scientists have great expectations in valuable raw materials which lie on the base of the ocean, and we need to try to ensure that we exploit these minerals in an environmentally friendly way. I'd also like to raise the issue of the link between oceans and inland transport. I think it's very important that the connection with inland shipping is in place, and the development of the Danube also has a real significance there. It is the longest river in the EU and can create a link between the Black Sea and the North Sea through the Rhine-Danube canal, and I think we ought to link the integrated marine policy with inland shipping. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herrn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Teurer. And of course you live at the very source of the Danube, so you have access to all the oceans of the world, thanks to that. The next speaker is Mr. Batten.
Thank you, Mr. President. It shouldn't surprise anybody that the EU wants to integrate maritime policy, just as it intends to integrate everything else across Europe in every aspect of life and public policy. I inquired in 2007 of the UK Marine and Fishing Agency how many fish were being caught in British waters. I was told, quote, "We cannot identify UK waters. They are now identified as being part of EC waters," unquote. So the UK no longer has its own territorial waters. Perhaps it's apt to be discussing this today, because today, as I'm sure you'll all be aware, is the 205th anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar on the 21st of October 1805, when Admiral Lord Nelson and many other brave men gave their lives and died so that Britain could remain a free and independent country. His dying words were, "Thank God I did my duty." UKIP MPs will do their duty this afternoon and vote against this.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Batten.
Thank you very much, Mr. Batten. The next speaker is Mr. Mölzer.
Herr Präsident.
Thank you, President. We still know all too little about our ecosystems in the oceans, particularly the beds of our oceans. This is a bit of an unknown area for us. Now, we know that oceans provide protein, provide food, but we also know that there are great challenges for this area for this century, and we have the whole issue of the climate system and human health, which are connected to that. Now, environmental measures are used to regenerate our waters. Look at the Great Barrier Reef, for instance, and look at what happened over the course of just 2 years with the increase in the fish stock there. Now, we know that approximately 50% of the world population lives not too far from the coasts of our seas. They could therefore be affected by a tsunami in future, so it's important for us to have emergency civil plans in place to help protect those populations. Also, emission ceilings for the EU. I think that what we have here, unfortunately, goes against the idea of a real integrated maritime policy. I think we should be more consistent, therefore. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Mölzer. And the next speaker, Mr. Luhan.
Thank you, President. The importance of an integrated maritime policy is undisputable, because the EU is the first maritime power, and almost 40% of our GDP is linked to the seas and to the coastal areas. The implementation of this policy must take into account all the regional specificities of the seas surrounding Europe. Each maritime region is unique and needs unique attention in order to have a sustainable use of its resources. At the same time, we should make sure this maritime policy enjoys suitable financing for the next programming period, because this is how we shall obtain a new approach aimed at favoring optimal development of all maritime activities in a sustainable way and encompassing all maritime areas. Thus, we shall obtain greater benefits with less impact on the environment. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege.
Thank you very much, Mr. Luhan. The next speaker is Mr. Arsenis.
Thank you very much, President. Commissioner, colleagues have discussed the substance of maritime policy, but I would like to talk about emissions. It is a delicate issue, of course. It is very much necessary to bear in mind the impact of emissions throughout the planet in order to really achieve reductions in emissions. And of course that means that we need an international agreement in the IMO. If we don't manage to reach this kind of agreement, then we will need to consider the possibility of regional measures, but that would be much more difficult to achieve. And if we do want to be successful, then we need to do what we have already done in the area of transport, for example, aviation. We will have to pay particular attention to emissions, and in particular to emissions in ports. Now, some solutions might be quite straightforward. We could have a carbon tax, for example. It could be simple and effective. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arsenis. The next speaker is Mr. KUHN. Thank you very much, President. I wanted to also speak about the EU strategy on transport from road to sea. That is, as you know, our motto. We want to be efficient, we want to be ecological, and in some areas, when you're talking about navigation, we shouldn't set environmental standards too high either, because this can be problematic for the Baltic Sea or other seas. Look how costly it becomes. Our colleague Fleckenstein and ITÄLÄ have already pointed this out to us. Therefore, Commissioner, there's a study that's going to be commissioned. We need to have a clear assessment of the situation. You know, we don't want a mode of transport that takes us from the seas to the roads, and then at the same time we need to look at the northern part of the Union, the Mediterranean region and other parts of Europe, make sure that there is equality. That is a basic prerequisite. Also, when you're talking about the integrated maritime policy, we need to make sure that safety of navigation is safeguarded. This is a very important part of the whole issue. We have an issue also with the Bosphorus region. Other colleagues have talked about that, about safety, about tankers that are crossing the Bosphorus Strait, and we have a lot of goods being transported there. We really need to have better safety measures in place. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Kuhn, says the President. The next speaker is Mrs. Ţicău.
Thank you, Mr. President. Commissioner, maritime transport and shipbuilding have a very important contribution to the economic prosperity of the EU member countries and provide important services to the European and world industry as well as to consumers. I would like to congratulate Mrs. Meissner for her report, and I would like to emphasize the importance of a free maritime space. I urge the Commission and the Member States to ensure conservation of small maritime ports, to expand the small distance transportation network in order to support the research and innovation in terms of merchandise transportation by the sea, in order to decrease transportation time and transportation costs, and to support the development of port infrastructure and intermodality. I would also like to emphasize the geostrategic importance of the Black Sea. The Council should demand from the Commission to draw a strategy for the Black Sea. Unfortunately, very little attention has been paid so far to the Black Sea, although it is very important strategically for the Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Ţicău. The next speaker is Mr. Gallagher.
Commissioner, the development of an integrated maritime policy is of vital importance to the Irish, the European and indeed the global economy. As an island-based economy, maritime transport is the cornerstone of Irish industry. Over 99%, and I repeat 99% in volume terms, of all Irish trade is transported by sea. It is estimated that the Irish marine industrial base is responsible for the employment of some 8,000 people, generating over 1.5 billion within the economy annually. The sector connects the Irish economy with the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. The sector is strategically vital to my country and to the recovery of the Irish economy. The rapidly evolving nature of the maritime sector requires a unified approach at a European level, and the growth in maritime activities such as maritime transport, development, aquaculture, tourism, combined with new uses of sea such as underwater technologies, offshore renewable energy and the blue biotech is increasing pressure on an already limited maritime space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gallagher. The next speaker is Mrs. Andrés Barea.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. The integrated maritime policy is a cross-cutting regional and sectoral policy, and fishing and aquaculture must be included within it. And it should not be subordinate to other policies. All are part of a response to environmental and economic problems in terms of the effects on society and on the fishing sector. New technologies, fishing gear, the development of species and a maritime economic plan should help us to generate more jobs, quality supplies and develop international relations to avoid piracy and to improve governance on the seas which have no borders and do not have problems of sustainability as in other areas. This could help for an integrated maritime policy. It could help us to improve the environmental and sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Andres Barea. And now our colleague, Mr. Brillo.
Signor Presidente.
Mr. President, I'm an Italian, not a Spaniard. So my name is Pirillo, not Perillo. I'm just telling you this. Yeah. So next time I hope you'll be able to call me to speak with my right name, because the same thing happened last night. I'm going to write to all the vice presidents in the chair of this House, asking them to call me by my right name. So thank you, Mr. President. Commissioner, the integrated maritime policy has a cross-cutting role. It takes into account various aspects of the environment and maritime research. The integrated maritime policy doesn't involve any idea of border control for illegal fishing. I hope that the finance for that policy is going to take this aspect seriously into consideration. Because there are new systems of monitoring the sea, including GMS. This cross-cutting aspect of the integrated maritime policy should be ensured from the community budget in the future, not from fisheries resources which are needed for specific actions. I'm very grateful to the rapporteur for this important report. And I hope that the Commission and Council will fall in line with our requests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perillo. I did cut your speaking time, and I have allowed you to say what you said because it's an important mention, and presidents are making great efforts, and I would gladly invite you to have an honourable combat on this, and we could pick out some names at random and see who can pronounce them best. But in any case, I think mistakes do happen in the course of battle, and I hope you can forgive me. Finally, Ms. Ayala Sender, please.
Gracias, Presidente. Por su generosidad, si querría.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted very warmly to thank Mrs. Meissner for the splendid job that she's done and for her ability to take up colleagues' amendments. There are two in particular that I'm grateful for. One that urges the Commission to improve working conditions at sea, and the extension into community law of the ILO Convention on the subject, and the provision of training for seamen, particularly bringing on board young people, including from third countries. And then there's the other amendment that urges the Commission to set up a localization and mapping system for wrecks and underwater archaeology. I come from Spain. We have long coasts and with a lot of wrecks along them. This is important to prevent the pillage and theft to which they're still subject. These are things, these two amendments added to all Mrs. Meissner's other excellent suggestions will contribute to this new maritime awareness that Europe needs.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ayala Sender. That closes the Catch the Eye session, and I'd like to give the Commissioner, Ms. Geoghegan-Quinn, the floor for closing comments.
Thank you, President. I know that Ms. Meissner at the beginning of the debate expressed her disappointment at the few members who were here in the building or here in the chamber. I think she should be very pleased that 37 speakers contributed to the debate, and we had indeed a very lively debate. And I think it has thrown up fresh ideas to encourage us to aim even higher in terms of maritime policies that we pursue. We must manage the finances stances of the EU concerning maritime issues in the context of the European Commission's proposal for a regulation to finance the integrated maritime policy in 2011, 2012 and 2013. The purpose of the proposed funding, namely €50 million, is to continue the work undertaken since 2007, to remove policy barriers and to unleash synergies by bridging all policies that impact on the sea, such as transport, fisheries, customs and marine protection, environment protection. The European Commission looks forward to working with Parliament on the timely entry into force of this regulation so that we can implement our future integrated maritime policy actions. Furthermore, maritime surveillance is an important new initiative which is set to engineer a huge change in all future actions by maritime authorities at sea and aims to install a common information sharing environment for the EU maritime domain. The communication from the European Commission concerning this initiative came out only yesterday. Sorry. I know I speak too fast. I'm sorry. It is the culmination of intensive work that has produced a 6-step roadmap to achieve in a short time the integration in maritime surveillance, which seemed extremely difficult to achieve just a few months ago. If I can turn to a number of specific questions raised, on the sulphur emissions, the Commission is fully aware of the concerns expressed by industry groups about the impacts that may occur due to the new marine fuel quality standards adopted by the IMO in 2008. That is why the Commission has called for and subsequently hailed the IMO agreement, which is now estimated to reduce the emissions of sulphur dioxide by up to 90% and, most importantly, up to 80% for secondary particulate matter. The Commission will present a proposal to align EU legislation with the IMO decision within the next months, and the proposal will be accompanied by a detailed report that will also include the outcome of our ex post impact assessment related to the IMO decision, as well as possible measures that the Commission could take to mitigate undesired impacts on the sector. Mr de Grandes Pascual raised the issue of the sea basins. The EU is aware of different situations in sea basins. It is developing appropriate strategies for each sea basin tailored to specific needs. And finally, Ms Rosbach and others raised the issue of an anti-disaster scheme. Well, this is the European Maritime Safety Agency, which is in charge of monitoring shipping safety. And this is the agency at present. It does not have legal competence to regulate in the area of environmental disasters, but discussions are underway within the context of the European Commission extending or renewing the mandate of the European Maritime Safety Agency at present. If more powers should be given, whether during the course of this more powers should be given to the agency in the coming years. Of course, the European Parliament will be centrally involved in the context of this issue. And finally, President, to conclude, in my capacity as European Commissioner with responsibility for research, innovation and science, I was very glad and very happy to hear that several members here in the Chamber raised the issue of the relationship between maritime policy generally and specifically research into marine and maritime policy. Just last week, the Belgian Presidency organised a very important conference in Ostend dealing specifically with this issue and bringing together scientists that are involved in the area. So it is a very important pillar of our integrated maritime policies. Can I thank Mrs Meissner again for her comprehensive and far-reaching report, and I believe we can now pursue the implementation of all future maritime initiatives with a renewed vigour and confidence. Thank you, and my apologies to the interpreters if I was speaking too quickly.
Ja, also die Frau Kommissarin, der ist
Commissioner, you weren't reading that out, but the debate is much better if members do not read texts out, going through something in 1 minute that you would normally take 2 minutes to produce. If you do that, nobody understands a thing except the mother tongue speakers, perhaps. If what you're aiming is a press communique, then that's something different. But if there is interpretation going on, you have to think of the interpreters. Mrs. Meissner, to close. Thank you, Mr. President. I think it's good that you counted, but 37 is a good number of people taking part in this debate, and I'm grateful to all of them. I forgot to thank all the shadow rapporteurs at the beginning. We worked together very constructively. It was great fun, and we've taken on board a great deal on this important subject. You will have seen that many different speakers have addressed different areas, but we clearly need a common approach of planning for research, for monitoring of the sea. So we need common governance and we need common monitoring, which is also in the report, but it's all very manifold in its developments. Mr. Fleckenstein mentioned two problems. We have included those. We want no distortion of competition on the one hand, but we also need to ensure that we can protect the environment better from shipping. But shipbuilding is not something that liberals and conservatives don't want. The question is whether we want a new pot of money, or whether we want to rebuild old ships, or whether we want a strategy. That's the question. Now, there was my amendment about bringing emissions trading in. That was lost by a small number of votes in the committee, but I think we're all convinced that we need to go down that road nonetheless, which is why I hope that I'll receive support there. Now, Mr. KOHLÍČEK, you said it's difficult to tie all these areas together, but it is possible. There are stakeholders, there are entrepreneurs from all the areas involved in the sea who meet twice a year and exchange ideas, and everyone is very happy with that exchange of ideas. And last point, this has been said, there are lots of different regions, particularly island areas. It's not true that I didn't include those. The only area that I didn't include in the strategy was the North Sea. I happen to live right on the coast of the North Sea. It's not only the Black Sea and the Danube, therefore, that are important, and I wanted to mention that. And perhaps one last word of conclusion. Thank you very much for the comment that we have a moral responsibility to future generations. That is exactly what I put in my title. We need a new awareness of the sea, and if we achieve that, we will have achieved a lot. Thank you very much.
Ja, vielen Dank, Frau.
Thank you very much, Rapporteur Ms. Meissner. That closes this debate, and I'd like to thank all speakers who have been respectful and polite to the rapporteur in following the whole of the debate. Before I close the meeting, Mr. Rübig has a point of order.
Thank you, President. A point of order. I would like to thank the office for the fact that we were able to conclude this debate a quarter of an hour before the vote. I think that's a very dignified way of concluding the debate. Colleagues can have a rest, other colleagues can come into the chamber. That's very good. Yesterday it didn't work at all, as well as that. And the planning was not really in tune with what we had expected, not at all. But today, really, congratulations to the table office. It's gone very well, and I very much hope that in future you will organise things in a similar way. You know, allow enough of a margin to make sure that the debate can be concluded properly and that we then have time before the vote. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Rübig.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rübig. That brings us to the end of the debate. And I will suspend the sitting until 12. And I hope that the visitors will be understanding that we will now be having a short break.